I paid for the trip, but they sent me home early so they could relax. That's what my own son told me, that my presence was too much. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Helen. I'm 72 years old, and I live in a small apartment overlooking Lake Michigan in Chicago. The morning light filters through my kitchen window as I make my coffee. The same routine I've had for 15 years since my husband Robert passed. My arthritis makes the simple act of opening the coffee jar a small victory, but I persist. The smell of fresh coffee mingles with the faint scent of lavender from the sachets I keep in my drawers. A habit Robert always found endearing. It had been 3 years since we'd taken a family trip. My son Ethan, now 45, worked in corporate finance downtown, always rushing between meetings and phone calls. His wife Emily managed a boutique in Lincoln Park, constantly posting pictures of expensive handbags and wine tastings on social media. They lived in a beautiful house in Evanston, a house I helped them buy, though that detail seemed forgotten in their busy lives. When my grandson Tyler turned 12 last month, something stirred in my chest. A grandmother's instinct, perhaps. I wanted to give him memories that would last, the kind Robert and I had dreamed of creating with our grandchildren. Tyler was always glued to his tablet, his young face illuminated by screens instead of sunlight. I thought maybe, just maybe, a family trip could bring us all together. I opened my savings account, the one I'd been quietly building for emergencies, and found enough for something special. $23,000. Money I'd saved quarter by quarter, skipping dinners out, buying generic groceries, repairing clothes instead of replacing them. Each dollar represented a small sacrifice, a future hope. I booked a beautiful lakeside cabin in Wisconsin for 5 days. The photos online showed floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking pristine water, a wraparound deck perfect for morning coffee, and bedrooms decorated in warm earth tones. I arranged everything: flights from Chicago, grocery deliveries, kayak rentals, fishing equipment. I even researched Emily's favorite herbal tea brand and had it shipped to the cabin. The phone call to Ethan felt like Christmas morning in reverse. "Mom, that's incredibly generous," he said, but his voice carried that familiar tone, the one he used when speaking to elderly clients at his firm. Polite but distant. "Are you sure you can afford this?" "I want to do this," I replied, adjusting my reading glasses as I looked at the confirmation emails spread across my kitchen table. "Tyler's only 12 once, and it's been so long since we've all been together." Emily's voice echoed in the background. "Tell her we appreciate it, but she doesn't need to go overboard." Overboard. The word stung, but I pushed it down. This was my gift to my family, my investment in memories that would outlast whatever time I had left. The night before the trip, I packed my suitcase with care. My best cardigan, the blue one Robert always said brought out my eyes, comfortable shoes for walking, my blood pressure medication in a weekly pill organizer, a photo of Robert to keep on the nightstand, as I always did when traveling. I folded everything with the precision of someone who'd learned that taking care of details was a form of love. I barely slept. The excitement felt foreign after years of quiet routine. I imagined Tyler's face when he saw the lake, Ethan relaxing for the first time in months, Emily maybe putting down her phone to watch the sunset. I pictured us cooking together, playing board games, sharing stories by the fireplace. The flight to Wisconsin was smooth. I sat in my window seat watching Chicago shrink below and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Pure, childlike anticipation. But from the moment we arrived at the cabin, something felt wrong. Ethan and Emily exchanged glances I couldn't decipher. When I suggested we unpack together and explore the property, Emily smiled, but it was the smile she used with difficult customers at her boutique. Too bright, too practiced. "Maybe you should rest, Helen," she said, using my first name instead of Mom, as she had for years. "You've done so much already. The altitude change can be tough." We were barely 200 feet above sea level. Tyler disappeared immediately into his room with his tablet and gaming headphones. When I knocked and asked if he wanted to see the lake, he mumbled something about updating his games. The first dinner was silent, except for the clinking of silverware against plates. I'd prepared herb-crusted salmon, Emily's favorite, and roasted vegetables. I set the table with the cabin's nicest dishes, lit candles, even folded the napkins the way my mother had taught me decades ago. "This is beautiful, Mom," Ethan said, but he was scrolling through work emails while eating. Emily complimented the food, but spent most of the meal photographing it for her Instagram story. "Cozy cabin vibes," she typed, carefully angling the shot to exclude me from the frame. That night, I lay in my bed listening to them laugh on the deck outside. Their voices carried through the thin walls. Animated conversations about Tyler's school, Emily's business expansion plans, Ethan's upcoming promotion. When I stepped outside to join them, the laughter stopped. "Oh, hey, Mom," Ethan said, shifting his chair slightly. "We were just talking about some work stuff, boring adult things." I retreated to my room and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The second day was worse. They planned a kayaking adventure while I was showering. By the time I emerged, they were already loading equipment into their rental car. "The morning session was full," Emily explained without meeting my eyes. "We'll be back for lunch." They returned 6 hours later, glowing with sun and exercise, full of stories about eagle sightings and hidden coves. Tyler actually looked up from his tablet to describe a fish he'd almost caught. I spent the day alone, reading on the deck, preparing their lunch, folding the towels they'd left scattered around the bathroom. Simple tasks that felt increasingly like penance. That evening, I overheard Emily on the phone with someone, probably her sister. "I know she means well, but it's just a lot," she hovers. "She wants to do everything together. We can't just relax with her watching our every move." The words hit like ice water in my veins. I was too much. My love was too much. My presence in the vacation I'd planned and paid for was too much. I stood at the cabin's kitchen window that third morning, watching them load the car for another family adventure I wasn't invited to join. The coffee mug trembled in my arthritic hands as memories flooded back. 30 years of being everything to everyone, and somehow never being enough. Ethan was 5 when his father died. A heart attack at 38. Sudden. Devastating. Final. I remember standing in our small apartment in Rogers Park, holding my sobbing little boy while the funeral director explained payment plans I couldn't afford. The life insurance barely covered the burial. Robert's dreams of providing for us died with him that gray November morning. I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Days at the Montgomery Ward customer service desk, nights cleaning offices downtown. Ethan would do his homework at the kitchen table while I folded laundry between shifts, his small voice reading multiplication tables aloud, while I sorted clothes that belonged to other people's families. "Mommy, when will you not be tired anymore?" he asked one evening, looking up from his math worksheet with those serious brown eyes that mirrored his father's. "When you're grown up and happy," I whispered, kissing the top of his head. "Then I can rest." I kept that promise. I skipped my own birthday celebrations to pay for his Little League uniforms. I wore the same winter coat for 8 years, so he could have the name-brand sneakers that would help him fit in at school. When other mothers went to book clubs and coffee dates, I worked overtime to save for his college fund. The scholarship to Northwestern was partial. I took out loans I'd be paying until my 70s to cover the difference. "It's an investment," I told myself, signing papers in the financial aid office while Ethan toured the beautiful campus he'd dreamed of attending. He'll remember this sacrifice. But standing in that cabin kitchen, watching him laugh with Emily as they planned their 3rd consecutive day without me, I wondered if he remembered anything at all. When Ethan graduated and started his finance career, I was so proud. My little boy in his first suit, shaking hands with executives, moving into a Lincoln Park apartment I helped furnish with my savings. He was becoming the man his father never got the chance to be. Then he met Emily. She was beautiful, sophisticated, everything I wasn't. She spoke about wine pairings and designer handbags with the casual authority of someone who'd never checked price tags or clipped coupons. At their engagement party, she introduced me to her friends as Ethan's sweet mother who works in retail, not as the woman who raised him alone, not as the person who sacrificed everything so he could afford the life that led him to her. Just retail. "She's lovely," I told Ethan later, though something about Emily's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. I'm happy for you. The wedding cost $43,000. They registered at Crate and Barrel and Williams-Sonoma, lists filled with items that cost more than my monthly rent. I bought what I could. A beautiful crystal vase that took 3 months of saved grocery money. At the reception, it sat on a gift table buried among Vitamix blenders and Le Creuset cookware sets from Emily's college friends. When they bought their house in Evanston 2 years later, the down payment was beyond their reach. The market is crazy, Ethan explained over dinner at my apartment, gesturing with his fork at the tuna casserole I'd made, his childhood comfort food. We need another $60,000, or we'll lose the house. I looked at my savings account balance that night, $68,000. Money I'd been setting aside for emergencies, for medical bills, for the possibility of needing long-term care someday. Money that represented 30 years of small sacrifices and careful planning. I want to help, I told them the next morning. Mom, we can't take your retirement money, Ethan protested, but his eyes lit up with hope. It's not retirement money, I lied. It's investment money. We'll put my name on the title too, just for legal protection. When you refinance in a few years, you can pay me back. That was 8 years ago. They never refinanced. My name stayed on the title, forgotten like an old warranty tucked away in a drawer. They lived in their beautiful house with their beautiful things, and I lived in my small apartment, watching my savings account statement show the same low balance month after month. But I told myself it was worth it. Family was worth it. When Tyler was born, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe being a grandmother would give me a new role, a new purpose. I drove to the hospital the moment Emily went into labor, paced the waiting room for 12 hours, held my breath until I heard his first cry. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, Robert's stubborn chin, my blue eyes. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Ethan was small. Pure, uncomplicated love. He's going to call you Grandma Helen, Emily announced from her hospital bed, her voice still weak from delivery. We think formal names are better for children. Not Nana. Not Grandma. Grandma Helen. I swallowed my disappointment and smiled. Whatever makes you happy. For Tyler's first year, I was the unofficial babysitter. Emily needed her rest. Ethan worked long hours. I'd drive from my apartment to theirs 3 times a week, arriving with homemade baby food and endless patience for 2 a.m. feedings. You're such a lifesaver, Emily would say, handing me Tyler before disappearing upstairs for her yoga class or book club meeting. I don't know what we'd do without you. But when Tyler started walking, started talking, started becoming his own little person, my services became less essential. The babysitting requests grew sporadic. Family dinners moved from weekly to monthly to holidays only. Tyler's in swimming lessons now, Emily would explain when I asked about visiting. And Ethan has that work dinner. Maybe next weekend? Next weekend became next month. Next month became whenever convenient. Yet somehow, I was always available when they needed something. Tyler's daycare tuition when Emily's boutique had a slow season. Car repairs when Ethan's bonus was delayed. The new fence for their backyard when they decided to get a dog. It's just temporary, became Ethan's favorite phrase. Just until we get back on our feet. But people who live in Evanston houses and drive BMW SUVs are already on their feet. I was just too blind to see it. Standing in that cabin kitchen, watching them laugh together while planning another day without me, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding for years. I wasn't their beloved mother and grandmother. I was their ATM with heartstrings attached. Every gift I'd given, every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd contributed, it had all been cataloged and calculated, not as love, but as obligation. They kept me around not because they valued my presence, but because they needed my resources. The realization hit like a physical blow, making me grip the kitchen counter for support. My reflection stared back from the window, a 72-year-old woman who'd spent her entire adult life making herself smaller so others could feel bigger. When had I stopped being Helen and become just useful? When had my love become currency instead of connection? The sound of their car pulling away interrupted my thoughts. Another day alone while they created memories I'd paid for but wasn't allowed to share. I walked to my room and sat on the bed, staring at the photo of Robert I'd placed on the nightstand. His young face smiled back at me, frozen in a moment when our future stretched ahead like an endless promise. I tried, I whispered to his image. I tried to be enough for everyone, but as I sat there in the silence they'd created around me, one thought kept echoing in my mind. Was I used? The question felt dangerous, like prodding a wound that had never properly healed. Because if the answer was yes, if 30 years of sacrifice had been nothing more than exploitation dressed up as family obligation, then everything I'd built my life around was a lie. And lies, I was beginning to understand, were much more fragile than the truth. The third morning at the cabin arrived with the sound of rain against the windows. Finally, I thought, maybe we'd spend the day inside together. Maybe the weather would force them to include me in whatever family bonding I'd paid $23,000 to witness. I was wrong. I woke early, as I always did, and padded to the kitchen in my slippers to start coffee. The ritual felt comforting, measuring grounds, listening to the machine gurgle to life, inhaling that first rich aroma of the day. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see the lake's surface dimpled with countless tiny impacts, like the universe was crying. By 7 a.m. I had breakfast planned. Blueberry pancakes from scratch, turkey sausage, fresh fruit salad. Tyler's favorites when he was smaller and still hugged me hello. I arranged everything on the counter, humming softly, an old song Robert used to sing while shaving. Ethan appeared first, already dressed in expensive outdoor gear. He grabbed a coffee mug without making eye contact. "Morning, Mom." His voice was flat, distracted. He immediately pulled out his phone and began scrolling through emails. "I thought we could make pancakes together," I offered, gesturing toward the ingredients I'd laid out like an offering. "Remember when you were little? You always wanted to flip them yourself. That's sweet. But we're heading into town. There's an indoor rock climbing gym Emily found online. Tyler's really excited about it." My stomach dropped. "In this rain?" "It's inside, Mom. Climate controlled. Professional instructors. It'll be good for Tyler to try something physical instead of being on that tablet all day." Emily emerged from their bedroom, also dressed in athletic wear that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and she wore the kind of makeup that was designed to look like no makeup at all. "Oh, Helen, you're up early," she said, noticing the breakfast preparations. "That's so thoughtful, but we already made plans." We grabbed granola bars. Tyler shuffled out in his pajamas, tablet already in hand, earbuds dangling around his neck like electronic jewelry. "Tyler, honey," I said, kneeling to his level despite the sharp protest from my arthritic knees. "Would you like pancakes? I have blueberries." He looked up briefly, his eyes, my eyes, focusing on me for perhaps 3 seconds. "We're going rock climbing," he mumbled, then returned to his screen where animated characters battled in colors too bright for the rainy morning. "Maybe when we get back," Ethan said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Don't wait up for us, though. These things can take all day." I stood there in my bathrobe and slippers, surrounded by ingredients for a breakfast no one wanted, watching my family prepare for another adventure that didn't include me. The rain seemed to grow heavier, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. "I could come with you," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. "I've never tried rock climbing, but I could watch. Maybe take pictures." Emily and Ethan exchanged one of their looks, the kind of wordless communication that excluded everyone else in the room. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I saw everything in it: irritation, impatience, and something that looked dangerously close to disgust. "The thing is," Emily said, her voice taking on that patient tone she used with difficult customers, "it's really more of a young family activity. Lots of noise, lots of physical movement, not really conducive to relaxing." Relaxing. The word they'd been using like a weapon since we arrived. "I understand," I lied. They left 20 minutes later, taking their energy and laughter with them. The cabin felt hollow without their voices, like a house where all the clocks had stopped at once. I stood at the window and watched their rental car disappear down the gravel driveway, red taillights swallowed by the gray morning. I cleaned up the breakfast that would never be eaten, putting ingredients back in containers, wiping down counters that weren't dirty. The blueberries stared at me from their plastic container, 79 cents each at the overpriced cabin grocery store, purchased because I remembered Tyler once saying they were his favorite. The day stretched ahead like a prison sentence. I tried reading, but couldn't concentrate. I attempted a crossword puzzle, but kept losing my place. I called my neighbor back in Chicago to check on my mail, but the conversation felt forced and hollow. By noon, I was hungry, but couldn't bear the thought of cooking for one. I made a peanut butter sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, staring out at the lake that looked as gray and unwelcoming as everything else. The hours crawled by with the sluggish persistence of chronic pain. I took a nap that wasn't restful, waking disoriented and more tired than before. I organized my already organized suitcase. I folded towels that were already folded. I watered plants that didn't need watering. At 4 p.m., desperation drove me to do something I'd never done before. I went through their things. Not maliciously. Not to steal or spy. I just needed to understand why I felt like such an outsider in a trip I'd organized and funded. Maybe I'd find some clue, some explanation for the distance that seemed to grow wider every hour. In Ethan's laptop bag, I found printed confirmations for activities I'd never heard of. Wine-tasting tours, couples massage packages, dinner reservations at restaurants 40 miles away, all scheduled for the remaining days of our family vacation. None included me. They had planned an entire parallel vacation within the vacation I'd paid for. They were using my cabin as a free hotel while creating their own itinerary, one where I was systematically excluded from every meaningful activity. My hands shook as I replaced the papers exactly where I'd found them. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I had to sit down on their bed to keep from falling. They returned at sunset, glowing with exercise and accomplishment. Tyler was actually animated, describing his successful climb up a supposedly difficult route. Ethan had pictures on his phone of Tyler wearing a safety harness, grinning with pride. Emily had already posted several photos to Instagram with captions about making memories and family adventures. I wasn't in any of the pictures. "How was your day, Mom?" Ethan asked, settling onto the couch with a beer from the refrigerator I'd stocked. "Quiet," I said. "That must have been nice," Emily commented, scrolling through her phone. "A whole day to yourself. No obligations, no schedule to keep. Very peaceful." Peaceful. Another word weaponized against me. I made dinner again. Chicken parmesan, Tyler's second favorite after pancakes. They ate it while discussing their rock climbing adventure, replaying moments I hadn't witnessed, sharing jokes I wasn't part of. I might as well have been the hired help, invisible except when plates needed refilling. That night, lying in my narrow single bed while rain continued to patter against the windows, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd been fighting for 3 days. I wasn't wanted here. I had paid for a family vacation where I was treated like an unwelcome intruder. I had funded my own exclusion, bankrolled my own humiliation. Every dollar of my carefully saved money had purchased another moment of rejection, another hour of loneliness, another memory that would haunt me for years. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the realization that this wasn't new. This was just the culmination of years of subtle dismissals, polite exclusions, and carefully worded rejections. How many family photos had I been cropped out of? How many conversations had stopped when I entered a room? How many times had they made plans around me instead of with me? I was the grandmother who was tolerated, not treasured. The mother who was useful, not beloved. The woman who existed on the periphery of a family she'd spent 30 years building, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome at her own party. The rain kept falling, and I lay there in the darkness, finally understanding that I wasn't grieving the loss of something I'd once had. I was mourning something I'd never had at all. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of my heart breaking in slow motion. Not the sharp crack of sudden trauma, but the gradual splintering of wood under too much weight, carried too long, by someone who'd forgotten she had limits. Tomorrow, I decided, I would stop pretending this was normal. Tomorrow, I would stop making excuses for people who saw my love as an inconvenience. Tomorrow, I would finally ask the question that terrified me most. If this was how they treated me when I gave them everything, how would they treat me when I had nothing left to give? The fourth morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed during the restless hours I'd spent staring at the ceiling. I rose before anyone else, as had become my pattern, and stood at the kitchen window watching the lake reflect the pale morning light like polished silver. I decided to make one last attempt. I prepared an elaborate breakfast spread: fresh orange juice, scrambled eggs with herbs from the cabin's small garden, bacon cooked until crispy, hash browns golden and perfect. I set the table with the cabin's best dishes, folded napkins into neat triangles, even picked wildflowers from outside to arrange in a mason jar centerpiece. Maybe if I tried harder, maybe if I made everything perfect, maybe if I showed them how much I wanted this to work. Ethan appeared first, drawn by the smell of bacon. He surveyed the elaborate setup with what looked like exhaustion rather than appreciation. "Mom, this is a lot." "It's our last full day," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "I thought we could finally spend some time together, as a family." Emily emerged, took one look at the breakfast display, and sighed audibly. "Helen, you really don't need to do all this." "I want to," I insisted. "I want us to have good memories of this trip." Tyler shuffled in, earbuds already in place, tablet tucked under his arm like a security blanket. He glanced at the table setup with the brief, disinterested gaze of someone accustomed to elaborate presentations made for his benefit. "Tyler, honey, put the tablet away for breakfast," I suggested gently. "Let's talk about what we want to do today." He looked at his parents, seeking permission I apparently didn't have the authority to grant. "Just let him eat in peace," Emily said, settling into her chair with obvious reluctance. "It's vacation." We ate in near silence. Ethan scrolled through his phone between bites. Emily took photos of her perfectly plated food for social media, typing captions about cabin mornings that would suggest a peaceful family gathering instead of the tense performance we were actually enduring. Tyler consumed his breakfast mechanically while watching videos with the sound turned low. I tried to start conversations about Tyler's school, about Ethan's work, about Emily's boutique. Each attempt met with polite but minimal responses that created more silence than they filled. "I was thinking," I said during a particularly long, quiet stretch, "maybe we could take a family photo today, by the lake." I brought my good camera. The suggestion landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread across the table. "We already have plenty of photos," Emily said, not looking up from her phone. "But none with all of us together," I pressed. "None with me in them." The words hung in the air, an acknowledgement of my systematic exclusion that made everyone uncomfortable. Ethan cleared his throat. Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Tyler remained oblivious, lost in his digital world. "We'll see," Ethan said finally, which we all knew meant no. After breakfast, they began their now familiar ritual of planning activities that didn't include me. Hiking boots appeared. Day packs were loaded with water bottles and snacks. Maps were consulted. "Where are you going today?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "There's a trail that leads to some waterfalls," Ethan explained, lacing his expensive hiking boots. "About 6 miles round trip. Pretty challenging terrain." The implication was clear. Too challenging for me. "I could drive to the trailhead," I offered. "Bring a book. Meet you when you're finished." Another look passed between Ethan and Emily. This one lasted longer, carried more weight. "Actually, Mom," Ethan said, straightening up and facing me with the expression I remembered from his teenage years when he was about to ask for something he knew I wouldn't want to give. "Emily and I have been talking." My stomach contracted into a cold knot. "We think maybe it would be better if you headed home early." The words hit me like physical blows. I actually took a step backward, my hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter for support. "What? You've been so generous," Emily continued, her voice taking on that syrupy tone she used when delivering bad news to customers. "Paying for this beautiful cabin, making all these wonderful meals, but we feel like you're working too hard, like you're not relaxing." "This isn't relaxing for me," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. This isn't what I thought it would be. Exactly, Ethan said, as if I'd just proven his point. You're stressed. You're trying too hard to make everything perfect. You need to rest. I can rest here, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. With my family. That's what I wanted. To spend time with you. But that's just it, Emily said, glancing at Tyler, who was mercifully absorbed in his screen and not witnessing his grandmother's humiliation. We feel like our presence is stressing you out, like you feel obligated to entertain us, cook for us, manage everything. That's not a vacation for you. The gaslighting was so complete, so elegantly constructed, that for a moment I almost believed them. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my desperation for connection was exhausting them. Maybe my love really was too much. We already changed your flight, Ethan continued, pulling a printed boarding pass from his pocket. This afternoon, the rideshare will be here in 2 hours. They had already packed my suitcase. I could see it sitting by the front door, zipped and ready, like luggage belonging to a guest who'd overstayed their welcome. My belongings had been handled by hands that couldn't wait to be rid of them, folded with efficiency rather than care. But it's our last day, I whispered. And now you can spend it at home, relaxing properly, Emily said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. No obligations, no pressure to take care of anyone else. I stood there in the kitchen where I'd made them countless meals, wearing the apron that had "World's Best Grandma" embroidered on it. A Mother's Day gift from Tyler when he was 6 and still thought I hung the moon. The irony was so cruel it felt intentional. "Where's Tyler?" I asked, looking around as if my grandson might materialize to protest this decision, to demand that his grandmother stay for the vacation she'd given him. "He's packing his tablet charger," Ethan said. "You know how kids are. They don't really get the emotional significance of these things." Tyler never came to say goodbye. When the rideshare arrived, a spotless SUV that felt like a hearse, Ethan carried my suitcase to the curb with the brisk efficiency of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary task. Emily hugged me with the professional warmth of a hotel concierge thanking a departing guest. "Thank you for everything," she said. "This was so generous of you." Was, past tense. As if my generosity had an expiration date that had already passed. Ethan's hug lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Have a safe flight, Mom. We'll call you when we get back." No tears. No regret. No acknowledgement that they were sending away the woman who'd paid for their vacation, who'd raised one of them from infancy, who'd sacrificed decades of her own happiness for their benefit. I sat in the back seat of the rideshare, watching the cabin grow smaller through the rear window. Through the large windows I could see movement inside. My family already returning to their normal behavior, no longer constrained by my unwelcome presence. The driver, a kind-faced man in his 60s, glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, ma'am?" I wanted to tell him that my son had just discarded me like expired food, that I'd been sent away from a vacation I'd paid for because my love was inconvenient. That 3 people who owed their entire comfortable existence to my sacrifices had just thrown me away like garbage. Instead, I said, "Fine, everything's fine." The flight home was a blur of recycled air and forced smiles from flight attendants who were trained to pretend passengers weren't crying. I sat in my window seat, the same seat I'd occupied 5 days earlier, filled with hope and anticipation, and watched the ground grow larger as we descended into Chicago. My apartment building looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier. The hallway smelled like other people's dinners and industrial carpet cleaner. My key turned in the lock with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, announcing my return to no one. The silence in my apartment was different from the silence at the cabin. This was the silence of abandonment rather than exclusion. This was the sound of a life that had been reduced to its most essential elements. One woman, one small space, one heartbreak too large to contain. I set my suitcase down and opened it on my bed. Inside, my clothes were wrinkled and hastily folded. My toothbrush was missing. My heart medication had been left behind. They had packed me like they were cleaning out a storage unit, grabbing what was obvious and leaving behind what required thought or care. But what destroyed me wasn't what they'd forgotten. It was what they'd remembered to exclude. Not one photo from the trip included me. Not one souvenir had been set aside for me to take home. Not one moment had been preserved to suggest I'd been there at all. I had paid $23,000 to be erased from my own family's memory. That night, I sat on my couch holding the one photo I'd managed to take. A blurry image of the three of them laughing by the lake, captured through the window during one of my many moments of exclusion. They looked happy, relaxed, complete. Without me, they were exactly who they wanted to be. With me, they were obligated to pretend they cared about someone whose only value was her willingness to give them everything they wanted. I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding for 30 years. I hadn't been loving them. I'd been funding them. And now that I'd seen what happened when the funding came with expectations of inclusion, I knew exactly what my role in their lives actually was. I was an ATM with emotions. And ATMs, I realized, weren't supposed to have feelings. 3 days passed in my apartment like a fever dream. I existed in a strange, suspended state, sleeping at random hours, eating spoonfuls of peanut butter straight from the jar, staring at my phone, waiting for the call that never came. The call where Ethan would apologize, where Emily would explain it had all been a misunderstanding, where Tyler would ask when Grandma Helen was coming to visit. The silence stretched on. On the fourth morning, I woke with a peculiar sensation. Not peace exactly, but the absence of the crushing weight I'd carried since returning home. I made coffee in my small kitchen, the same ritual that had comforted me at the cabin, but this time the silence felt different. Instead of exclusion, it felt like possibility. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, something I rarely used except for checking emails and occasionally looking at Emily's Instagram posts that never included me. But today, I had a purpose. I opened my banking app and stared at the numbers. My savings account showed 4,247 through. 3 months of careful budgeting had barely begun to replenish what I'd spent on the vacation. But there was another account, one I'd forgotten about in my years of focusing on everyone else's needs. The certificate of deposit Robert had set up before he died. 30 years of compound interest on $5,000 he'd insisted we couldn't touch. "For real emergencies only, Helen," he'd said, kissing my forehead the night before his heart attack. "Promise me you'll only use it when you have no other choice." The balance showed $23,147.62. I stared at the number, remembering Robert's words. A real emergency. No other choice. 30 years of being treated like a convenient resource while my own needs went unmet seemed to qualify. I called Daniel Hoffman, Robert's best friend and the only lawyer I knew personally. We'd exchanged Christmas cards for decades, but hadn't spoken since Robert's funeral. His secretary put me through immediately. "Helen Morrison." His warm voice came through the phone, carrying decades of shared memories. "What a wonderful surprise. How are you, sweetheart?" The kindness in his tone, the first genuine warmth I'd heard in weeks, nearly broke me. I need help, Daniel. Legal help." "What's going on?" I told him everything. The vacation, the years of financial support, the house with my name still on the title that I'd forgotten about until this moment of desperation. He listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and growing anger. "Helen," he said when I finished, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge?" "I want respect," I said without hesitation. "I want to matter." "Good answer. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Bring any documentation you have about the house, the loans, any financial contributions you've made. We're going to explore your options." That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cooked for myself. Not leftovers, not something quick and easy, but an actual meal. Salmon with herbs, roasted vegetables, rice pilaf. I set my small table with my good dishes, the ones I saved for company that never came, and poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion that never arrived. Halfway through dinner, my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For 30 years, I would have answered on the first ring, eager to hear from my son, grateful for any contact. Tonight, I let it ring 4 times before picking up. "Hi, Mom." His voice was different, cautious, testing. "Hello, Ethan. How are you feeling? Better, I hope? More rested?" The gaslighting continued even now. I was supposed to thank him for sending me away, to confirm that their rejection had somehow benefited me. "I'm fine," I said, cutting into my salmon with deliberate precision. "Good, good. Listen, Mom, we wanted to thank you again for the cabin. It was really generous. Tyler had a great time." I said nothing. "Mom, are you there?" "I'm here. I'm having dinner." "Oh, well, I won't keep you. I just wanted to— We have some news, actually. Emily's boutique is expanding. She's opening a second location in Wilmette. It's a huge opportunity, but the initial investment is pretty substantial." And there it was, the real reason for the call. They'd enjoyed their Ethan and Emily vacations so much that they were ready to fund the next phase of their lives with more of my money. "How much?" I asked. "Well, the lease deposit alone is $15,000, and then there's inventory, fixtures, marketing." His voice gained momentum as he outlined Emily's business plan with the enthusiasm he'd once shown when describing his Little League games. "How much total, Ethan?" "Around 40,000. We know it's a lot, but the profit projections are really strong and— No. The word came out of my mouth before I'd consciously decided to say it. Simple, clear, final. Silence stretched across the phone line. "I'm sorry. What?" "No. I won't be giving you $40,000. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This isn't a gift. It's an investment. We'd pay you back with interest. It's a legitimate business opportunity." How many times had I heard similar promises? How many temporary loans had become permanent gifts? How many investments in their future had yielded returns that benefited everyone except me? I said no, Ethan. But you have the money. I know you do. The CD Dad left. You never touch it. The fact that he knew about Robert's emergency fund, had apparently been cataloging my assets for years, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. "That money isn't available," I said. "What do you mean it's not available? It's your money." "Exactly. It's my money." Another silence. This one charged with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Shock, maybe. Or anger that I was deviating from the script he'd written for this conversation. "I don't understand what's gotten into you," he said. And for the first time in our conversation, his mask slipped. The careful politeness was replaced by something colder. "You spend $23,000 on a vacation but won't invest in Emily's business. That doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense to me." "Look, if this is about the cabin thing, if you're upset that we thought you needed rest—" "This isn't about the cabin," I interrupted. "This is about 30 years of being treated like a bank instead of a person. That's not fair." "Isn't it? When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you visited without needing something? When was the last time Tyler spent time with me because he wanted to, not because you needed a babysitter?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, because that's exactly what they were. "We're family," Ethan said finally, and I could hear the bewilderment in his voice. This was not how these conversations usually went. Usually, I said yes. Usually, I found a way to give them what they wanted. Usually, I prioritized their needs over my own financial security. "Yes, we are family," I agreed. "And family members should treat each other with respect. They should include each other in celebrations, not send each other away from vacations they paid for." "You're being dramatic." "Am I? Or am I finally being honest?" He hung up without saying goodbye. I finished my dinner in peace, the salmon tasting better than any meal I'd eaten in months. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not empty, but full of potential. Full of choices that belonged to me alone. Later that evening, I did something else I hadn't done in years. I took a bath. A real bath, with expensive bath salts I'd been saving and candles I'd never lit because they seemed too precious to waste on an ordinary evening. I sank into the warm water and felt something release in my chest. Tension I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't a natural part of my body. For the first time in decades, I was accountable to no one. No one needed me to cook dinner, do laundry, solve problems, or fund dreams. No one was keeping score of my usefulness or calculating my value based on my willingness to sacrifice. I was just Helen, not Mom who pays for things, not Grandma Helen who babysits, not the woman who existed to make other people's lives easier. Just Helen. And maybe, I thought as I watched the candlelight dance on the bathroom walls, maybe Helen was enough. The next morning, I dressed with more care than I'd taken in years. Not the practical clothes I wore for shopping and errands, but my good slacks. A silk blouse Robert had always complimented. Earrings that caught the light. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not an elderly woman who'd outlived her usefulness, but a woman who'd finally remembered she had choices. Daniel's law office was in a converted Victorian mansion in Lincoln Park, all dark wood and leather-bound books that suggested tradition and permanence. His secretary offered me coffee in a real cup and saucer, not a paper cup. And when Daniel emerged to greet me, his hug felt like coming home. "You look wonderful," he said, and I believed him. We spent 2 hours going through documents I'd brought, bank statements, loan papers, the house title with my name still legally attached to the property. Daniel's eyes grew sharper as we worked through the timeline of my financial contributions to Ethan and Emily's life. "Helen," he said finally, leaning back in his leather chair, "you have options here. Legal options. Your name is on that house title as a co-owner, not just a co-signer. According to Illinois law, you could force a sale of the property and claim your portion of the proceeds. How much would that be?" He did some quick calculations on his legal pad. "The house is probably worth around $400,000 now. Your original down payment, adjusted for appreciation, you could be looking at somewhere between $150,000 to $200,000. The number hit me like lightning. Life-changing money, security for my remaining years. The kind of independence I'd never dreamed possible. But, Daniel continued, there's something else to consider. Are you prepared for the consequences? Because once you start this process, your relationship with your son will never be the same. I thought about Ethan's phone call the night before, the way he'd hung up when I'd finally spoken honestly about how I'd been treated, the years of being taken for granted, ignored, excluded, and discarded. "What relationship?" I asked. Daniel smiled, not with happiness, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves with greed and entitlement. "Then let's discuss your next steps." For the first time in 30 years, those next steps belonged entirely to me. The legal papers were filed on a Thursday morning in October, when the Chicago air carried the first real bite of winter and the trees along Lakeshore Drive had begun their slow surrender to gold and amber. Daniel handled everything with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years navigating family disasters dressed up as legal proceedings. I didn't hear anything for 5 days. Then Emily called. I was watering my small collection of houseplants, something I'd started doing with religious devotion since returning from the cabin, as if nurturing something living might help me remember what care actually looked like. When my phone rang at 8:17 a.m., Emily never called me. In 8 years of marriage to my son, she'd probably initiated contact with me fewer than 10 times, and always for specific purposes, coordinating babysitting, asking about family medical history for Tyler's school forms, requesting my cornbread recipe for a dinner party where I wasn't invited. "Helen." Her voice was sharp as winter wind, stripped of all pretense of warmth. "We need to talk." "Good morning, Emily." Just don't. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I set down my watering can and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the lake that stretched gray and endless toward a horizon I couldn't see. The morning light made the water look like hammered pewter, beautiful and cold and unforgiving. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The house, Helen. The fucking house. Our lawyer called yesterday. Apparently you're trying to force us to sell our home?" The profanity was new. Emily had always maintained her carefully cultivated image of refined politeness around me, even when her contempt was obvious. Hearing her mask fall away completely was almost liberating. Finally, the truth, with no pretty wrapping. "I'm exercising my legal rights as a co-owner," I said calmly. "Co-owner?" Her voice pitched higher, incredulous. "You're not a co-owner. You helped with the down payment 8 years ago. That doesn't make you an owner." "Actually, it does. My name is on the title, Emily. It always has been." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Then I heard her breathing. Sharp, angry exhalations that spoke of someone trying to control rage that threatened to consume rational thought. "This is insane. You can't do this to us. We have a child. We have a life here." "So did I." I said quietly. I had a life that included the family I spent 30 years building and supporting. Until you decided my presence was too much? That's not… We never… You're twisting everything. Am I? Or am I finally seeing it clearly? Another silence. Then the sound of muffled conversation. Emily had covered the phone, but I could hear fragments. Her voice urgent and desperate. Another voice responding with what sounded like equally frantic energy. Ethan wants to talk to you, Emily said when she returned to the phone. Mom. Ethan's voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not the polite distance of recent years. Not the casual dismissal of the cabin, but something raw and desperate. What are you doing? I'm protecting my investment. Your investment? Mom, this is our home. This is where Tyler grows up, where we built our life. You can't destroy that. I didn't destroy anything, Ethan. I gave you the down payment for a house, and my name went on the title as protection for that investment. Now I'm claiming what's legally mine. But why? Why now? We can work something out. If you need money, if this is about the business loan, this isn't about money. Then what? What do you want? The question hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. What did I want? For 30 years, I'd wanted to matter. I'd wanted to be included, valued, loved for more than my utility. I'd wanted to be seen as a person rather than a resource. But that ship had sailed the morning they packed my bags and sent me away from a vacation I'd funded so they could relax without me. I want you to understand that actions have consequences, I said. I want you to know what it feels like to have someone you trust make decisions about your life without consulting you. This is different, and you know it. Is it? You made decisions about my vacation without consulting me. You made decisions about my relationship with Tyler without consulting me. You made decisions about how much of my presence you could tolerate without consulting me. How is this different? Because this affects Tyler. The desperation in his voice was becoming anger, frustration at a conversation that wasn't following his usual script. He's 12 years old, Mom. This is the only home he's ever known. And I'm 72 years old. And this was the only family I've ever known. But that didn't stop you from sending me away. We didn't send you away permanently. We thought you needed rest. Stop lying, Ethan. To me and to yourself. You sent me away because my love inconvenienced you. Because including me in the vacation I paid for required effort you weren't willing to make. That's not… He stopped, the denial dying in his throat because we both knew it was true. I've spent 30 years making your life easier, I continued. Paying for things you wanted, taking care of responsibilities you didn't want to handle, being available whenever you needed something while asking for nothing in return except to be treated like I mattered. And the moment I became slightly inconvenient, you threw me away. We didn't throw you away. You packed my bags without asking. You changed my flight without telling me. You sent me home from a family vacation because my presence was too much. Oh, what would you call that? The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger, the voice of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. What do you want us to do? Apologize? Fine. I'm sorry. Emily's sorry. We handled the cabin situation badly. We should have been more considerate. Is that what you want to hear? I want you to mean it. I do mean it. No, you don't. You're sorry you're facing consequences, not sorry for how you treated me. You're apologizing because I have leverage now, not because you recognize that what you did was cruel. The conversation was deteriorating rapidly, civility crumbling under the weight of decades of unspoken resentment and newly acknowledged truths. So what? This is revenge? You're going to destroy our family because your feelings got hurt? I'm not destroying your family, Ethan. I'm removing myself from it. There's a difference. By forcing us out of our home, by claiming what was always legally mine. The court documents say you want the house sold within 60 days. Emily's voice cut in. She'd taken the phone back, or they'd switched to speaker. 60 days, Helen. Do you understand what that means? We have to find a new place to live, enroll Tyler in a new school, uproot our entire life because you're having some kind of emotional breakdown. Emotional breakdown. The phrase was so perfectly, Emily, clinical, dismissive, designed to make my legitimate grievances sound like the irrational complaints of an unstable old woman. "I'm not having an emotional breakdown," I said calmly. "I'm having a financial awakening." "This is crazy," Emily continued. "Absolutely insane. We're going to fight this. Our lawyer says there are ways to challenge the sale, ways to prove you're not acting in good faith. Good luck with that." "Mom?" Ethan's voice again, pleading now. "Please, think about Tyler. Think about what this does to him." The Tyler card. Of course. The final manipulation. The ultimate guilt trip designed to make me prioritize my grandson's comfort over my own dignity. "I am thinking about Tyler," I said. "I'm thinking about the lesson he's learning by watching how you treat people who love you. I'm thinking about whether I want him to grow up believing it's acceptable to discard family members when they become inconvenient. So you're going to discard us instead." "I'm not discarding you. I'm billing you." The conversation ended with Emily's voice rising to a pitch that probably disturbed neighbors. Threats about lawyers and challenges, and proving mental incompetence. Ethan tried to regain control of the call, his voice cycling between anger and desperation, and something that might have been grief. I hung up while they were still talking. That afternoon, Daniel called with an update. "They've hired Reynolds and Associates," he said. "Expensive firm. They're going to fight this hard. Can they win? They can make it unpleasant and expensive. But the law is clear, and the documentation is solid. Your name is on the title. You contributed to the purchase. You have every right to force a sale. How long? 3 months? Maybe 4 if they drag it out. But Helen, are you sure about this? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. Your relationship with your son will never recover." I thought about the family I'd spent 30 years building, the sacrifices I'd made, the love I'd given freely and received conditionally. I thought about Tyler, who barely looked up from his tablet when I was around, who'd been taught that my affection was something to tolerate rather than treasure. I thought about the woman I'd been before I learned that love was supposed to hurt, supposed to require endless giving without receiving, supposed to mean making yourself smaller so others could feel bigger. "What relationship?" I asked Daniel, just as I had weeks earlier. "Fair point," he said. "I'll file the motion to accelerate the sale." That evening, I sat in my small apartment and looked through photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Pictures of Ethan as a baby, as a toddler, as a young man at his graduation. Pictures of Tyler learning to walk, to ride a bike, to swim. In almost every photo, I was the one taking the picture. I existed behind the camera, capturing their moments, preserving their memories, documenting their happiness while remaining invisible in the narratives of their lives. I closed the albums and put them away. Tomorrow, I would start learning how to be visible in my own story. Tomorrow, I would stop being the narrator of other people's happiness and start being the protagonist of my own. 6 weeks after the legal papers were filed, I did something I hadn't done in 47 years. I bought myself a dress for no reason other than wanting it. The boutique was in Lincoln Park, 3 blocks from Emily's store. A detail that felt less like coincidence and more like destiny. The saleswoman was perhaps 60 herself, with silver hair styled in a way that suggested confidence rather than resignation to aging, and eyes that sparkled with the kind of mischief I'd forgotten was possible at our age. "That color is stunning on you," she said as I emerged from the dressing room wearing a deep emerald wrap dress that had caught my eye in the window. "It brings out your eyes beautifully." I stood before the 3-way mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. The dress fit properly, not hiding my body but honoring it, acknowledging that a 72-year-old woman could still be beautiful, still be worth dressing well, still deserve to take up space in the world with grace and intention. "When's the special occasion?" the saleswoman asked as she rang up the purchase. "Today," I said. "Today is the special occasion." I wore the dress to lunch at a restaurant I'd walked past countless times but never entered. The kind of place with cloth napkins and wine lists, and waiters who treated single diners with respect rather than pity. I ordered salmon with risotto and a glass of Pinot Grigio, and I ate slowly, savoring flavors that had nothing to do with feeding anyone but myself. The maitre d' seated me at a window table overlooking the lake, and as I watched sailboats drift across water that sparkled like scattered diamonds, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a meal in public alone. For decades, dining out had been about family gatherings, celebrations for other people, occasions where my role was to facilitate everyone else's enjoyment while ensuring my own needs remained invisible. Halfway through lunch, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Tyler. Dad gave me your number. Are you really making us move?" My heart clenched, then steadied. Tyler, my grandson, reaching out for the first time since the cabin disaster, and of course it was about what I was taking from him rather than what had been taken from me. I typed back, "Hello, sweetheart. Yes, I am." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, why? How do you explain 30 years of emotional neglect to a 12-year-old? How do you help a child understand that sometimes love requires saying no, requires setting boundaries, requires refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your humanity? Because sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions to protect themselves, I wrote back. But this hurts us. I know. I'm sorry about that. Then why are you doing it? I stared at the question for a long time, watching condensation form on my wine glass, listening to the gentle conversation of other diners who seemed to navigate their relationships with ease I'd never mastered. Because for a very long time, I let people hurt me to avoid hurting them, and I finally learned that was the wrong choice. No response came. I finished my lunch, paid my check, and walked home through neighborhoods where I'd once imagined living when my sacrifices were finally rewarded with inclusion in the prosperity I'd helped create. The house sale was proceeding with the grinding inevitability of legal machinery. Ethan and Emily's lawyer had filed motions and challenges that Daniel batted away with the weary expertise of someone who'd seen every desperate maneuver families employed when money and emotion collided. "They're grasping at straws," he explained during one of our weekly updates. "Trying to prove diminished capacity, undue influence, anything that might invalidate your claim. But you're clearly competent, acting independently, and the law is unambiguous. You own half that house." 3 weeks later, the court approved the sale. 60 days to closing. I didn't hear from Ethan or Emily during that period, but their rage reached me through other channels. Margaret Chen, a neighbor I'd known for 15 years, called to report that Emily had approached her in the grocery store, crying and desperate, asking if Margaret thought I was having some kind of breakdown. "She wanted me to call you," Margaret said, her voice careful and diplomatic, "to talk sense into you. She seems to think you're not thinking clearly." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that in the 30 years I've known you, I've never seen you think more clearly about anything." The validation felt like sunlight after a long winter. I used some of Robert's emergency fund to hire a travel agent, something I'd never done before, always planning trips myself to save money that could be spent on other people's needs. Susan Hartley specialized in solo female travel, and when I explained that I was recently liberated from family obligations and wanted to see Paris, her smile suggested she'd helped many women like me discover the world beyond their sacrifices. "First trip to Europe?" she asked. "First trip anywhere that wasn't about someone else's needs." We planned 10 days in Paris for the spring, staying in a small hotel in the Marais district, with museum passes and Seine River cruises and reservations at cafes where I could sit alone with a book and watch the world move around me without requiring my participation or management. The sale closed on a gray December morning. Daniel met me at the title company with papers to sign and a cashier's check that represented more money than I'd ever held at one time, $173,412. After legal fees and taxes, enough to transform my remaining years from careful budgeting to genuine choice. "Congratulations," Daniel said as we walked out into the weak winter sunlight. "You're officially financially independent." That afternoon, I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I drove to Tyler's school. Jefferson Middle School released students at 3:15, and I positioned myself across the street where I could watch without being obvious. At 3:17, Tyler emerged with a group of friends, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his head bent toward his phone as usual. He looked taller than I remembered, older somehow, as if the stress of the past months had accelerated his growth in ways that had nothing to do with physical development. When he laughed at something one of his friends said, I caught a glimpse of the boy I remembered from years earlier, before tablets and family tension had taught him that joy was something to be rationed. I didn't approach him. I didn't call out or try to intercept his walk home. I just watched my grandson living his life, understanding with crystalline clarity that his relationship with me would be whatever Ethan and Emily chose to make it, and that trying to force connection would only harm him further. But I also understood something else. I loved him enough to let him go. I loved him enough to stop fighting for a relationship that had been poisoned by his parents' resentment. I loved him enough to become someone he might want to know someday, when he was old enough to understand that love and money were separate currencies, and that one couldn't be exchanged for the other without destroying both. That evening, I started writing. Not a journal, not a letter, but a story. The story of a woman who spent 30 years trying to buy love and finally learned that the only person whose approval she needed was her own. I wrote about Robert, about the promises we'd made, and the one I'd kept too long after it ceased serving anyone. I wrote about Ethan as a child, brilliant and curious and affectionate, and tried to understand where the sweet boy had gone who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. I wrote about Emily, trying to see past my resentment to understand the woman who'd learned that manipulation was more effective than appreciation, that taking was easier than giving. I wrote about Tyler, about the grandfather he'd never known who would have taught him that women were to be cherished, not used, about the grandmother he'd lost when his parents decided my love was conditional on my utility. Most of all, I wrote about Helen, about the girl who'd married young and loved completely, who'd believed that sacrifice was the highest form of affection, who'd confused enabling with nurturing until she couldn't tell the difference between love and obligation. And I wrote about the woman Helen became when she finally remembered that she was worthy of the same care she'd spent decades giving others. The first draft took me 3 months to complete. I printed it on good paper, bound it in a simple cover, and placed it in my desk drawer. Someday, perhaps, Tyler would be old enough to read it. Old enough to understand that his grandmother had loved him enough to save herself, so that if he ever needed someone who knew how to set boundaries while keeping her heart open, she would still be there. Spring arrived early that year, Chicago's brutal winter surrendering to unexpected warmth that coaxed daffodils from frozen ground and reminded everyone that seasons change, that what seems permanent rarely is, that endings make space for new beginnings. My plane to Paris left on a Tuesday morning in April. As I settled into my window seat, business class, because life was short and I'd earned comfort, I thought about the woman who'd boarded that rideshare behind the cabin 8 months earlier. Broken and discarded and convinced she'd outlived her usefulness. That woman was gone. In her place sat someone I was still getting to know, a woman who could eat alone in restaurants without apologizing for taking up space, who could buy herself beautiful things without justifying the expense, who could love people without needing them to love her back in exactly the way she wanted. A woman who had finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued. A woman who had discovered that the most revolutionary thing she could do was refuse to make herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. A woman named Helen, who was no longer anyone's ATM, anyone's convenient resource, anyone's invisible supporter. Just Helen. And Helen, it turned out, was more than enough. 1 year later, I was sitting in a cafe in Montmartre, watching the sun set over Paris, while writing in a journal I'd started keeping during my travels, when my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't heard from in months. Tyler, now 13, presumably with more independence over his communication choices, he was calling on a Saturday evening Chicago time, morning in Paris, where I'd been living for 3 months in a small apartment near the Marais that I'd fallen in love with during my spring trip. Grandma Helen? His voice was deeper than I remembered, carrying the awkward uncertainty of adolescence, but also something else. A tentative hope that made my chest tighten with emotions I'd learned to feel without drowning in. Tyler. What a wonderful surprise. I got your postcard, the one from the Eiffel Tower. I'd been sending him postcards from my travels, not frequently, not with any expectation of response, but as small offerings of love that asked for nothing in return. A card from London's British Museum, another from the canals of Amsterdam, a picture of the northern lights from Iceland that had taken my breath away. I hoped you'd like it. You're really living in Paris? I am. Temporarily. I'm taking French lessons and visiting museums and learning how to make proper croissants. That's really cool. A pause, then, Dad says you're never coming back. The statement hung between us, heavy with the weight of whatever story Ethan had constructed to explain my absence, my choices, my transformation from obliging grandmother to independent woman living the life she'd always dreamed of. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. I'm still figuring out what comes next. Are you mad at us? At me? The question broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. Tyler, trying to navigate the adult complexities that had shattered his family's foundation, wondering if his grandmother's liberation was somehow his fault. Oh, sweetheart, no. I'm not mad at you. I could never be mad at you. But you're mad at Dad and Emily. I looked out at the Parisian street scene. Couples strolling hand in hand, families sharing evening meals at sidewalk tables, the eternal dance of human connection playing out in one of the world's most beautiful cities. I'm not mad anymore, I said, surprised to realize it was true. I was hurt for a long time. I felt unappreciated and taken for granted, but anger is exhausting, Tyler. And I decided I'd rather spend my energy on joy. Joy? Yes. Joy. Learning new things, seeing new places, meeting new people, discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. Another pause, longer this time. When Tyler spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger. I miss you. The words hit me like warm rain after drought. Simple, honest, without agenda or expectation. Just the truth of a child who'd lost someone important and was finally old enough to articulate the loss. I miss you too, sweetheart, every day. Could I maybe visit you sometime? When I'm older? Tyler, you could visit me tomorrow if your parents would allow it. My door is always open to you. Always. Really? Really. And when you're 18, if you want to come to Paris or wherever I am then, you won't need anyone's permission but your own. We talked for another 20 minutes. About school, about his friends, about the books he was reading and the video games he was playing. Normal grandmother-grandson conversation that felt precious precisely because it required no emotional labor from me, no careful navigation of other people's expectations or resentments. When we hung up, I sat in the cafe's golden light and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: peace with uncertainty. I didn't know if Tyler and I would have a relationship as he grew older. I didn't know if the damage done by his parents' choices could be repaired. But I knew I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own well-being to force connections that others weren't equally invested in maintaining. 2 months later, back in Chicago for a brief visit to handle some financial matters, I received an unexpected invitation that would change everything again. Margaret Chen called to tell me about a new nonprofit forming in our neighborhood, a support group and resource center for older adults who'd been financially exploited or emotionally abused by family members. The founder was a social worker named Patricia Williams, whose own mother had been similarly mistreated by Patricia's siblings. She's looking for people to share their stories, Margaret explained. Not for pity or sympathy, but to help others recognize the patterns and find the courage to set boundaries. The first meeting was held in the community room of our local library. 15 women ranging in age from 58 to 82, each carrying stories that mirrored my own in heartbreaking detail. Sarah, whose daughter had drained her retirement account to fund a series of failed business ventures. Maria, whose son had convinced her to co-sign loans she couldn't afford, and then defaulted, destroying her credit. Janet, whose entire family had stopped speaking to her when she refused to continue paying for their vacations. When my turn came to speak, I found myself telling not just my story, but Tyler's story. How love sometimes meant stepping away. How setting boundaries could be an act of grace rather than selfishness. How refusing to enable dysfunction was actually the most loving thing you could do for everyone involved. I paid for a vacation where I was treated like an inconvenience, I said to the circle of women who nodded with recognition. And I thought that was normal. I thought love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection people were willing to give me in exchange for my money and service. What changed? Asked Patricia. I realized I was teaching them how to treat me. Every time I accepted disrespect, every time I funded my own exclusion, every time I apologized for having needs, I was showing them that I believed I deserved exactly what I was getting. The group met weekly, I started attending regularly, sharing my journey from victim to survivor to someone who'd built an entirely new life on the foundation of self-respect. The women called me an inspiration, but the truth was, they inspired me, their courage in facing difficult truths, their determination to reclaim their dignity, their willingness to risk loneliness in pursuit of authentic connection. 6 months later, Patricia asked if I'd consider becoming a co-facilitator for the group. The role would involve training, certification, and a commitment to helping other women navigate the complex process of setting boundaries with family members who viewed them primarily as resources to be exploited. I said yes immediately. The training took place over several weekends at a conference center outside the city. I learned about family systems theory, financial abuse patterns, trauma-informed care, and the legal resources available to older adults in crisis. But mostly, I learned that my story wasn't unique, that thousands of women my age had spent decades prioritizing everyone else's needs while their own souls slowly starved. On the final day of training, during a role-playing exercise where I practiced helping a hypothetical client set boundaries with an exploitative son, something clicked into place that had been shifting for months. This was my purpose. Not being the perfect mother or grandmother who sacrificed herself for everyone else's happiness. Not being the convenient ATM who funded other people's dreams while abandoning her own. Not being the invisible woman who existed to make everyone else's life easier. My purpose was helping other women remember that they mattered, that their needs were valid, that love without respect wasn't love at all, but manipulation dressed up in family obligation. 3 years have passed since that devastating morning at the cabin when I packed my broken heart into a suitcase and flew home to face the ruins of everything I'd thought I was building. Today, I live in a beautiful one-bedroom apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, furnished with things I chose because I love them rather than because they were practical or inexpensive. My walls are covered with photographs from my travels, not family photos where I'm cropped out or missing entirely, but images that tell the story of a woman who finally learned to center herself in her own narrative. I lead 3 support groups now, helping women understand that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's survival. That you can love someone completely while refusing to fund their dysfunction. That sometimes the most generous thing you can do is stop enabling people to treat you badly. Tyler and I exchange emails now. Brief, friendly updates about his high school activities and my work with the Women's Center. He's never visited, and I've stopped hoping he will. But he knows where to find me if he ever needs someone who loves him without conditions. Someone who's learned that the best way to honor love is to protect your own capacity to give it freely. Ethan sent a card last Christmas, the first communication in 3 years. A generic holiday greeting with a brief note. "Hope you're well, Mom." No apology, no acknowledgement of what happened, but also no anger. Just the careful distance of someone who'd learned that I was no longer available for the relationship we used to have. I sent a card back with an equally brief message. "I am well. I hope you are too. Emily, I never hear from. But sometimes I see her posts on social media through mutual acquaintances. She and Ethan bought a smaller house after the forced sale, in a less expensive neighborhood. They seem to be managing, adapting to a life without unlimited access to my financial resources. Tyler appears happy enough in the photos, surrounded by friends, growing into the kind of young man his grandfather would have been proud of. They survived my boundaries. In fact, they're probably better off for them. And I am thriving in ways I never imagined possible. Last week, a woman named Susan joined our support group. 74 years old, recently widowed, being pressured by her adult children to sell her home and give them the proceeds while she moves into assisted living she doesn't need. Her story was so familiar, it could have been my own 3 years earlier. "I just don't know how to say no to them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They're my children." "I understand," I told her, holding her hand across the circle of women who'd all learned the same painful lesson. "But here's what I wish someone had told me years ago. Your children are adults now, and adults are responsible for solving their own problems, not expecting their parents to sacrifice their security and dignity to make their lives easier." "But what if they stop talking to me?" I thought about Tyler's emails, Ethan's Christmas card, the family I'd lost and the woman I'd found in the ruins. Then you'll learn something important about the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them. And Susan, that knowledge, painful as it is, will set you free. The group meeting ended with our usual ritual, a moment of silence for the women we used to be, and a commitment to honor the women we're becoming. Walking home along the lake path that evening, watching the sun paint the water in shades of gold and rose, I reflected on the question that had haunted me for so many years. Was I used? Yes, I was used. But I survived being used. And in surviving, I discovered that I was also useful, not as a source of endless giving, but as a guide for other women learning to find their own way out of the darkness of selfless love that had lost all connection to genuine care. I thought about the woman who'd collapsed in that rideshare 3 years ago, crushed by the weight of rejection and abandonment. She'd believed her story was ending. She had no idea it was just beginning. Have you ever felt like your love was taken for granted? Like your sacrifices went unnoticed? Like you were valued more for what you could give than for who you are? Type yes if you've ever wondered whether setting boundaries with family might be the most loving thing you could do, for them and for yourself. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the most important message someone needs to hear is that they matter, that their needs are valid, and that it's never too late to choose themselves. Let's make sure this message reaches someone who needs to know they're not alone.